Hello, and welcome back to the studio. I'm Dr. Wigo, and today we're going to talk about RAMageddon, the RAMpocalypse, all the other silly names that people have come up with for the RAM shortage. Now, I touched on it in my Apple price hikes video, which is linked up here, but RAMageddon, or the RAMpocalypse, is the shortage of RAM, or the rapidly increasing prices of RAM, due to tremendous demand, and that's why Apple had to hike their prices, because memory costs were running up so high. And not just memory, we'll talk about that in a minute. So I thought I'd put on my professor hat and do a little history and economics about RAM, and why everybody's talking about it now. As you probably know, RAM is a fundamental component of anything that computes. Computers, phones, game consoles, anything that has a processor in it usually also needs memory, and that's usually going to be RAM. And RAM over the years has seen a slow but steady improvement. We went from DDR3 to DDR4 to DDR5. DDR stands for double data rate, by the way. There's always been a bit of a trade-off between capacity and speed, but they've been working on that. And the newest trend is for LPDDR, or low power DDR. That's what Apple and all the other phone makers need. They need low power DDR so that they can get all this stuff done. Over the years, RAM has become a commodity, so brand is not really a factor. It's all being bought for components and then put into other things. But the fabrication plants used to make RAM cost billions of dollars and take years to bring online. That's why we're not going to see relief anytime soon. Over the years, the RAM industry has kind of concentrated into three main global suppliers of RAM chips: Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. Two Korean companies and an American company. These three companies produce over 90% of the world's supply of RAM chips. Other brands then repackage these RAM chips and put them into modules like this one that you'll stick into a computer or anything. Maybe you thought, I've never bought memory from any of those three companies. Well, yes, you have. So concentrating the industry primarily into these three companies has produced what in economics we call an oligopoly. And they were prosecuted by the Department of Justice and found guilty of price fixing and paid hundreds of millions in fines. Some Samsung executives even went to prison 20 years ago. And now there's a new lawsuit that alleges the same kind of collusion has led to the current price hikes, although that one may not turn out the same way. Because going back to economics, it's all about supply and demand. Now, demand has slowly risen over time as more devices use more memory, but that hadn't been a problem because the companies were able to keep up with it. But now the demand is spiking due to all these data center build-outs that I mentioned in the video about how AI is going to destroy us all down below. Now, these data centers want high bandwidth memory, or HBM. HBM is harder to make, and until recently, it was lower profit than the DRAM business because of long-term contract pricing. The thing that Micron complained about, they said the reason DRAM prices are high is because Apple and companies like it have negotiated such low prices for RAM. But now this new AI demand, which therefore does not have long-term contracts already in place, all of a sudden makes HBM way more profitable. So the supply starts dropping of regular RAM because the manufacturer is all switching over to HBM. Micron went as far as to shut down their consumer division, which was called Crucial, to concentrate solely on the corporate customers, mainly HBM for data centers. So more demand and less supply means higher prices for regular RAM. And it's not just RAM. SSDs, solid-state drives, which has basically been another commodity for many years, all of a sudden is feeling the same price rises for same reasons. AI data centers need SSDs too. And guess what? The NAND flash makers, which is what goes into SSDs, that's also a oligopoly. It's Samsung, again, Kioxia, which was formerly Toshiba, who also has a joint venture with Western Digital, Micron again, SK Hynix again, and SK Hynix acquired Intel's NAND division a while back. But wait, there's more. Hard drives, another commodity, is also being hit with this increased demand and an inability to increase supply. Oh, and it's also an oligopoly. Seagate, Western Digital, and Toshiba make almost all the hard drives in the world. Now, this isn't as bad as the SSDs, and certainly not as bad as the RAM, yet, but it's just going to continue to get worse. Well, what's next? How do we get out of here? Well, this is the problem. Because these semiconductor manufacturing fabrication plants, the fabs, are so expensive, billions of dollars, and have really long lead times, it takes years to get them up online, the supply will not be going up anytime soon. And unless the demand for HBM for AI data centers slacks off, there's not going to be much more production of DRAM. In economics, when this happens, you suddenly will have new entrants coming in because they see the profits going on. But no new entrants are expected because everybody knows after all this is over, it's going to go back to commodity pricing, which means no one will have an advantage and everybody will make about the same amount of profits, and it really won't be worth the trouble of spending the billions of dollars in order to get the fabs up and running. And because AI is so power hungry for all these data centers to run all these huge models, demand won't be going down anytime soon. So what are we to do? Well, the fourth largest RAM manufacturer in the world is in China, and it's called CXMT. But it's been subject to US export restrictions and essentially been blacklisted, so people can't use it. This has not stopped Apple from exploring this. Apple has been exploring sourcing from CXMT for devices that are intended for the China market, which that kind of gets the US out of the process since the phones are made there and the memory would be made there, so it wouldn't be subject to US jurisdiction necessarily. But Apple has also spent the last couple of months lobbying the government to relax these rules against CXMT so they could buy that RAM and use it in US-bound products. It may not bring prices back down, but it may keep them from going up any further. So that's my quick and dirty explanation of RAMageddon and the RAMpocalypse. It all boils down to oligopolies, commodity prices that are now no longer commodity prices, oligopolies where there's only a few companies and so they can maybe collude, which is what the lawsuit says they're doing. But the companies say, no, we're just acting in our own best interest. This is not a conspiracy. It's just that we're all doing what makes most sense, which is switching to HBM, because now HBM is more profitable, because now most of the long-term contracts they have are for regular RAM, not for HBM. So we can expect this to last for quite a while before RAM prices dip back down to where they were just a year ago. Some RAM has gone up over 700%. It's crazy because there's not enough supply and the demand is increasing. And in economics, it's all about supply and demand. So there's not really anything we can do except hope that maybe Apple can get the government to let them use the Chinese RAM, which will take a little bit of the pressure off. But in the long run, we just have to get the supply and demand to stabilize back to an equilibrium state where we're not in this super high demand and super low supply. Although technically it's not super low supply, it's still the same supply we had before, except it's not because of the shift from the RAM to the HBM. This is very complicated, and I haven't explained it that well, but I did my best. In short, do not expect RAM prices and therefore Apple's device prices and everybody else's device prices to go back to normal anytime soon, maybe 2 years from now, if we're lucky. So you may just have to spec your next system with less RAM and a smaller SSD and no hard drives, because remember, they're going up too. So this is the way it's going to be for a while. But this is also a problem for AI because most of the models run locally in AI are run on Mac Minis and Mac Studios because they have the memory capacity, but now they're not going to have the memory capacity, except at exorbitant rates. So RAMageddon or the RAMpocalypse is a real thing, that it's really hurting AI as well as hurting everybody who doesn't like AI, like me, and there's nothing we can do about it. Well, sorry to depress you, but that's it for today. Thanks for stopping by. See you next time. Bye-bye. And I will try to find a less depressing topic for my video next week. Thanks for staying to the end. Bye-bye.